Good afternoon, I'm George from Ireland. This video is about the March on Rome, which is a part of the a rise of fascism option in the A-level history syllabus. So we're looking at Italy in 1922. To recap the situation, Mussolini had found the Fasci di Combattimento in 1919. Italy was just coming out of the First World War. There was very high unemployment, great turmoil, disruption. His fasci had changed themselves into the Voluntary Militia for National Security, giving the English language version of its name, but the word fasci or fascisti were completely acceptable, the fascists. They'd been contesting elections. Mussolini and some of his colleagues had been elected to the Italian parliament. In 1922, fascist strength was growing. They were fighting against communists a lot. The Popular Party had called a strike against the fascists, but it failed. The fascists were quite willing to beat people up or indeed kill them in order to break strikes. Some big businesses saw the fascists as potential allies, were paying them to act as muscle on the streets, breaking up trades unions and defeating strikes. Quite a lot of fighting in northern Italy, which is the most industrialized part of Italy and the wealthiest. Though I say it was an affluent area, that doesn't mean that everybody was rich. Most people were working class, and quite a lot of them were very badly paid. Some of them were jobless. There was a strike at the Alfa Romeo factory in Milan, which was defeated by the fascists, who would just beat up or indeed kill some of the strike leaders. The fascists controlled many key installations in the Po Valley in northern Italy. The prime minister at the time was a liberal named Luigi Facta, and he had a reasonable relationship with Gabriele D'Annunzio, who was one of the luminaries of the fascist party, not actually the leader. That was Benito Mussolini. The victory over Austria-Hungary in the First World War had been the 4th of November. So the 4th of November 1922, they were going to celebrate the 4th anniversary of their victory in the First World War. And the Prime Minister, Facta, had asked D'Annunzio, a fascist, to organize the victory parade in Rome. Some of the royal family were sympathetic towards fascists, particularly the Duke d'Aosta. The Duke d'Aosta was the eldest son of the king. The king was Victor Emmanuel III, given the English language version of his name. So in the United Kingdom, the monarch's eldest son has the title of Prince of Wales. It's Prince Charles. At the moment, in Italy, the monarch's eldest son is the Duke d'Aosta. Let me see. So they were attracted to fascism for various reasons, as in it emphasized Italian unity. Remember, Italy had only been united about 70 years earlier. Some people had a very strong regional identity, didn't believe that they were Italian, or at least thought that was fairly unimportant, would prefer to Italy to break up, to have several independent countries. What else? The fascists were very anti-communist. Having said that, they did adopt some of the communist methods of organization and indeed street violence. People knew how horrendous things were in Russia after the Russian Revolution, and that's why they didn't want these things happening in Western Europe, with many massacres carried out by communists who'd taken away virtually all people's rights in terms of freedom of expression, right to own property, freedom to worship, right to leave the country even. Not that the communists were big on civil liberties themselves. Mussolini was the man who coined the word totalitarian. He wanted a total state with the government in control of everything and very little individual liberty. The establishment, people like the royal family, right-wing politicians, they did have misgivings about the fascists, partly for being yobs. Also, the fascists sometimes made socialist noises, talked about big revolutionaries. The fascists were anti-clerical, as in they felt the Catholic Church had too much influence in Italy, that laws should not be made to please the Catholic Church. Mussolini gave a speech in Naples on the 24th of October 1922, saying that the fascists are going to take power in Italy, and that's it. That's what we're all about. We've been very plain about that. Elected or not, we'll simply seize power. It's notable that he's giving the speech in Naples, as I say, which is the main city in southern Italy. Fascism is mainly a northern Italian phenomenon. Mussolini is from near Forlì in northern Italy. The fascist movement really became popular in the Milan area, But ironically, that's where the communists were also a very visible presence. So Milan was the second biggest city in Italy and was a real tinderbox of political extremism. So because of the spiralling political violence, the Prime Minister, Luigi Facta, asked the King, Victor Emmanuel III, to sign martial law, giving the government extraordinary powers to arrest Mussolini. Facta had been flirting with the fascists a bit earlier, but he was frightened about all their bellicose rhetoric and their vow to launch a putsch. The King refused to do so, and then the government felt powerless. If they were not going to be given what they needed to stop this fascist threat, maybe they just better fold. Mussolini said he wanted a march on Rome. From the 22nd of October 1922, the March on Rome officially began, and some men from Milan, a few thousand of them, began marching south to Rome. However, the March on Rome did not occur as fascists later mythologized it. The King dismissed the Prime Minister, and he invited Mussolini to come to Rome to form a government. Mussolini was going to be appointed Prime Minister. In fact, the title was President of the Council. If we translate it literally from Italian, we'll just call it Prime Minister, because that's the equivalent in the British system or systems in other countries. So Mussolini arrived in Rome by first-class train. He did not march there, though in subsequent fascist propaganda he pretended that he'd walked there all the way from Milan, and there are photos of when he did join marches briefly at times on his way to Rome. Many of his supporters came by train, but some of them did indeed march all there. So it was a march in Rome, not a march on Rome. It was a parade on the 29th of October 1922. About 15,000 fascists marching around Rome saying, see, we've taken over the government. But really they achieved office through somewhat legal means, being appointed by the King. And they did have a presence in Parliament, though they weren't the largest party. Notably, this was the sort of method to be replicated by the Nazis in 1933 in Germany, where some of the conservative elite thought they could use the Nazis and really co-opt them to their cause, but foolishly didn't realize they would not be able to control these people once they put them in office. So there Mussolini was Prime Minister. The fascists were still not that huge, still very much concentrated in the north. They didn't set up a dictatorship overnight. The fascists began to dismantle democracy bit by bit. So it was the piecemeal erection of a totalitarian state. Mussolini was using salami tactics like communists had done in other countries, as in you cut off a thin slice, and then another slice, and then another, and then another, gradually taking away people's civil liberties, gradually making it harder and harder to remove you from office, tilting elections more and more in your direction, likewise suborning the judiciary and so on, getting the police to do your bidding, using the police as a weapon against legitimate dissent. Soon Mussolini would say there was no such thing as legitimate dissent. So it took about 4 years before the fascists were firmly in the saddle. Now, to begin with, corporations, the wealthy, the aristocracy, the royal family, to some extent the Catholic Church, right-wing politicians, they felt they could cooperate with the fascists and they could tame the fascists. Mussolini came from a lower middle class provincial background, that he was a bit dim, that he wasn't a significant threat to them. He'd been in the army in the war, he hadn't been an officer. So they underestimated him. He was cannier than they had realized. As a former newspaper editor, he was a very gifted propagandist. He understood the power of publicity, not only newspapers, but radio, which is a very new thing. Radio had just been launched in Italy as something for people to listen to, previously been something for the army to communicate by. And as Mussolini liked emphasizing, it was an Italian, Guglielmo Marconi, who'd invented the radio about 30 years before this. So those are the key facts to know about the March on Rome, which is how the fascists came to office. In the next video, I will tell you how the fascists managed to step by step set up their dictatorship and to get rid of Italian democracy.